Hi, I'm Lisa Headley, and I'm going to be sharing an ego processing technique that I like to use to bring awareness to the unconscious. Because all of us have to do ego processing work in order to reach self-actualization, it's important to know exactly who we are from an ego perspective in terms of what we are consciously putting out in the world, what we are projecting, what we are repressing to the unconscious and to the formation of a shadow side. So this is a technique that I utilize. It's a journaling technique that will help just bring awareness to those places where you might be stuck. So for lack of a better example, I'm going to use President Trump because he's a very obvious example of a public figure that we can all relate to, and he runs regular ego processes that are pretty obvious. So I call the processing technique squares. I did not develop this technique. My mother did, actually, and it's something that she has taught a lot of people to do. It's something that I use in my own work with my clients, and it's something that I have used in my life to clear up my own ego projections. So there are four corners to the square. They are based on the understanding that the ego operates from a place of desire and fear. We attach ourselves, grab hold of the things that we desire to form our persona, things that keep us safe, and we banish the things that we fear. And so the square basically identifies the things that we desire and the things that we fear. And the first way to do that is to identify the process itself. So in this example, I'm going to use the victim-tyrant process because President Trump runs that one regularly, and it's very obvious. So we identify the corners of the square. The first would be desire to be a tyrant. That would be the first corner. Then fear of being a tyrant. That would be the unconscious side. And the flip side of that is going to be the desire to be, to be a victim. President Trump likes to run the victim one. And then the fear of being a victim. So these four corners create one completed square. They are the conscious and the unconscious processes of this particular polarity. So the next step is going to be to identify each of the roles and the actions within each square. So let's start with the desire to be a tyrant. This one's pretty obvious. The desire to be a tyrant. President Trump loves power and attention. Even if it's negative, it's still power and attention. So in order to complete the square, I would write down every reason that President Trump would desire to be a tyrant. On the flip side of that would be the unconscious side. This is the side that Trump is not aware of. Fear of being a tyrant. He doesn't care. The part of him, the unconscious part of him that would care, he has banished to the unconscious. He's not owning it at all. So the fear of being a tyrant would be things like alienation, right? Just this week, President Trump has alienated our G7 allies. It's unbelievable, but he's done it. So fear of being a tyrant. So anything that I could add to that, fear of being a tyrant, why would Trump fear being a tyrant? And this is where it gets hard, because you're digging around in the unconscious and you're looking for those places that you don't want to own about yourself, right? Alienation would be a big one. But what about something like insecurity? He's very insecure, and he definitely doesn't want to own that. So then, to complete the square, you move on to the other side of that. For Trump, fear of being a victim would be the conscious side of this process for him. So things like, right, a witch hunt. It's unfair. Aw, boo-hoo. There might be consequences for your actions. So he doesn't want to be a victim. But he's not owning any of that. And the unconscious part of his of this particular side of the square would be the desire to be a victim, which he would never own at all. Why would he desire to be a victim? For him, playing victim gets him attention. What else does it get? He's looking for, he wants respect, right? Unfortunately, this is not how we earn respect. It's literally earned. It's not demanded. So this is a big one, a big square for him. And if you could dig around in here, especially in those corners that are unconscious, he could make some significant shifts in who he is. Because when we start to see those unconscious places that we are not owning in ourselves, we bring mindful awareness, and we're also in a position to unravel the knot of that polarized dynamic. If it's no longer an attachment for us, we're not running it anymore. It doesn't have any power. So the idea behind the square is ultimately to make the list as long as you can in each corner, and then offer it up. Fully acknowledge that you have this square, that you are running this process, and then put it out there to the universe and ask for balance. Ask for this to no longer be something that holds any sway in your life, because this is a powerful tool that will clear up all of your ego processes if you allow them to. So doing squares for everything that we could be running. Victim tyrant just happens to be a pretty obvious square, and it's especially obvious in the world right now, both with our president and with dictators and other circumstances where there are people who are very much in a role of being victimized. Everyone could use this square. It's a square for a more egalitarian future. But there are many squares that come to mind in terms of our own lives, right? Where we have any kind of reactivity to something. If there's reactivity, there's a square to process. So my suggestion is to simply start to bring awareness to what you're reacting to. And that can be you're feeling vulnerable. And so you would want to do a square about the flip side of vulnerability, which would probably be, well, in that particular polarization, it might be empowered. I actually see vulnerability as a strength, but you might not. So trying to figure out what the upside is going to be the transcendent position. So identify the dynamic polarity that you're running, the opposites, right? And then look at what you can find in terms of a transcendent position if you do the work, because you might find that being vulnerable turns out to be a strength when you stop utilizing it in an attached way. And that's where the square helps. It works to alleviate our attachments. And that's what the ego is doing, forming attachments. Everything exists in a flow, right? Everything exists in a flow of grace, and we are simply observing that flow if we have reached a transcendent position. If we haven't, then we're down in the ego and down in reactivity. And being down in reactivity, you're grabbing a hold. You're like, oh, I feel unhappy. Oh, I feel sad. Oh, I feel neglected. Oh, I feel, you know, whatever it is, you attach yourself to the emotion and then you stew in it, and it becomes something that ultimately gets you stuck, energetically stuck. It gets you stuck in terms of productivity. It gets you stuck emotionally. And so using squares is really just about bringing as much awareness to how your ego attaches to things, and doing it so that you can get back into that flow. Yes, your ego is attached. Yes, it's aware of these things. It wants to process them. Maybe I'm having a reaction, but I don't need to define myself as that. The idea is that you get to that transcendent position when you recognize a reaction. You recognize, oh, I'm behaving selfishly. Oh, I'm being negligent. Oh, I'm being, however you're being. And then you just work to clear it up. If you can recognize that the opposite of what you're doing is also a part of who you are, the potential that you are, then you can own it. The idea of squares is just to recognize a polarity, being able to see a polarity, being able to own the polarity as who you are, the full potential of who you are, and then clearing it up. Okay, so just to give a little more illustration about how these are essentially polarized dynamics, I've listed some very obvious examples that are happening in the world as we speak. So these would be some examples of squares that we could all process. Scarcity and abundance, limited time versus abundant time, neglect versus indulgence, selfish versus selfless, apathetic versus engaged, rejection versus loved, entitlement versus humility. These are pretty common, that are pretty up in the world right now as we find ourselves so divided. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there's ever been a better time to start processing through these polarized dynamics, because when we start to do the work, we start to create more balance in ourselves, and that balance will in turn be reflected in the world around us. So I encourage anyone, whenever you're having some sort of reactivity, be it one of these squares that I've just listed or something else that's coming up for you personally in your life, to sit down and spend some time looking to find the unconscious parts of yourself that you need to acknowledge and integrate so that you can be more balanced and confident moving forward. So, thank you.